All right, we're going to cover really all of Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 within sort of the same unit, or actually the same lecture. So we're going to cover the basics and foundation, and we're going to make the best out of them. We'll go into more details when we actually have class time together, but these are really the highlights. So this whole section is probably the biggest thing to take away from both of them. All right, the major stuff, though, for what we're covering, which is photosynthesis and cellular respiration, is that they provide energy for life. So life requires energy. I mean, think about it. Us going to school just requires some energy. All right, so in almost all ecosystems, energy ultimately comes from the sun. In photosynthesis, by the way, that's a key point. In photosynthesis, some of the energy of sunlight is captured in chloroplast. Atoms of carbon dioxide and water are rearranged, and then it produces sugar and oxygen. So that's kind of where we're going to start with, is the photosynthesis. So we might say as an essential question for this section is, what is the process of photosynthesis? Process of photosynthesis. We're going to have two, though. So we'll get to the other part when we get there. All right. So before we can do all of photosynthesis, which, by the way, this part's Chapter 7. Some of this gets a little confusing from jumping to one section to another, so it's probably best to kind of follow along. But we're in Chapter 7, so photosynthesis fuels the biosphere. So plants are autotrophs. Auto, so if you look up both of these things in your root word sheet, auto means self, okay, and trophs means nourishment, or to nourish. So we'll put nourish. So think about it, you eat and you nourish your body. But for autotrophs, they self-nourish. So they sort of nourish or feed themselves. So they can sustain themselves. They don't usually consume organic molecules derived from other organisms, and they make their own food. So if you self-nourish, you make your own food. That's through our process of photosynthesis. And we can convert CO2 and H2O into sugars and other organic molecules. Okay, so we have a couple of different things, but our big one here is photoautotroph. So remember, auto means self. Oh, this little stylus is going to be mean to me today. All right, troph is nourish. Okay, and photo is light. So the whole word can be broken down to these things use light to self-nourish. Okay. So they use energy of light to produce organic molecules, or essentially food. We do have some things that are called chemoautotrophs, and so they use chemicals, so some inorganic chemicals as their energy source. So they use chemicals to self-nourish. We, on the other hand, are going to be different. We need some different food materials. So same thing, troph is still referring to nourishment, okay, but hetero means different. So we're referring to getting our nourishment from different sources. So we have different nourishments. So we have to feed on plants and animals, or some things decompose, but we're getting that material from different places. Okay, so photoautotrophs actually feed us, clothe us, house us, provide us with energy, light, transport, manufacturing. That's what photoautotrophs can do for us. All right, there are a couple of different things. So plants, for sure, is that's what we think of. But also we have a whole set of things called algae, and these guys are a protist, so even this kelp stuff is a part of an algae. And we also have some other things called cyanobacteria. So they're just these kind of blue-green bacteria things that we'll talk about a little bit later on. Okay, so plants, algae, some types of bacteria can be photosynthetic. All right. Photosynthesis in plants takes place in chloroplasts. That's a thing that we're going to need to get to know. Photosynthetic bacteria actually have some enfolded regions of the membranes, and they have clusters of pigments and enzymes, just basically everything that, sort of a chloroplast would do. But the chloroplast is that organelle where photosynthesis takes place. Within our chloroplast, we do have some important stuff called chlorophyll. Excuse me. But it's an important light-absorbing pigment in chloroplast. So it's responsible for the kind of the green color in plants, and it plays a central role in converting solar energy to chemical energy of food or sugar. Okay. Chloroplasts are concentrated in these cells called mesophyll. So these are the green tissue of the interior of the leaf. So for the most part, the leaves are kind of the photosynthetic organs. That's where we tend to see most of this stuff occurring, is in the leaf. That was a terrible looking leaf, but you get the idea. All right, stomata are actually little tiny pores in the leaf that allow carbon dioxide to enter and exit, or oxygen to exit. So it allows for gas exchange. All right, so veins in the leaf deliver water absorbed by the roots. That's the whole point. Okay, so here's the mesophyll section of a leaf. It's just that kind of interior section. You can see lots of these cells are concentrated with chloroplasts. So it's kind of showing you that the little green dots around the outside are the chloroplasts there. So for us to kind of look at it, which we will here in just a second, is we actually need some important stuff here. So we need a vein to deliver in some water. So water is going to come in here to our system. These guys will also take in CO2. So all these chloroplasts are going to need the CO2 and the water delivered from the veins in order to produce sugars. Okay, so that's our next thing coming up. Chloroplast consists of an envelope of two membranes which encloses an interior compartment that's filled with fluid called stroma, and it contains a system of interconnected membranous sacs called thylakoids. So it's a lot of words, but we do need to know thylakoids and stroma. That's one of the things I do typically go over. Okay, I'll draw one for you instead. Let me back it up here. So basically what we're going to need to know is, and we can cover it a little bit later, but we have maybe a chloroplast that sort of looks like this. We're going to have a stack here of membranes and then a liquid interior. So this interconnected membrane that looks sort of like coins will be our thylakoid, and our stroma will be kind of the liquid or juicy kind of interior of the chloroplast. Okay. So thylakoids are these interconnected stacks. When you have multiple stacks or like multiple thylakoids in a stack, it's called a grana, which we'll go over. All right, so the thylakoid membranes house much of the machinery that converts light energy to chemical energy. So the membranes are where all this stuff occurs. All right, and we'll talk about it here in just a little bit. We also have some chlorophyll molecules that are built into those thylakoid membranes, and they capture the light energy. Okay, so we'll go over and review some of these things, but a chloroplast just has an outer membrane and inner membrane. It's got a stack of thylakoids that we call a granum, because one single one is a granum. And then they've got each of those little stacks of coins is a thylakoid membrane. The juicy stuff in the middle is the stroma. Okay, I'm basically going to give you the quick overview on this one. I want you to have the wording because we're going to need to review this later. So this is a reference that you'll want to keep in some capacity, because when we review these steps, this is where we're going to go to. But again, we'll talk through most of it, and I'm going to give you the very, very overview stuff, but it's important to sort of have this as you move forward. So keep this as a reference, because next class period we'll go over these in detail, but I'll kind of talk to you about them. And then, like I said, we'll go over pictures and talk about what's happening a little later on. So photosynthesis occurs in two stages. We have first the light reactions, which you do need to know. So step one is the light reactions, and that occurs in those thylakoid membranes. In these reactions, okay, that's the big point, but what's going to happen in these reactions is that we're going to split water. It'll be our source of electrons, giving off oxygen as a byproduct. So we can trace what's happening here. Oh no, I may have deleted an important slide here. It's okay, we're going to come back to it. Again, keep this as a reference. So water and then oxygen. Okay, ATP is generated from ADP by adding on a phosphate group. The light energy is absorbed by the chlorophyll molecules, so we use light, and it helps us to move to transfer some electrons. Okay, so we actually end up getting an electron and we get an NADPH, as a thing we'll talk about later. Okay, NADPH produced by the light reactions, produces kind of a reducing power, is what we call it, to the Calvin cycle. So the big thing here with the light reactions is we start with water, we end up producing oxygen, and then we're going to produce ATP and NADPH with light present. All right. Again, we'll go over lots of details later, so that's the basics. Again, you'll want this one as a reference too. But the second stage that we need is from the Calvin cycle. So it occurs in the stroma. The Calvin cycle is this whole cyclic thing that we're not going to go over, but it is a friggin' mess. You're welcome. If you get into that later, do take time. If you're in, science classes for majors, take your time with it. It's a tough one. But the Calvin cycle is kind of a cyclic thing. That's why we call it a cycle. And so it's going to assemble or make a sugar using CO2 and the energy-rich products from the light reactions. So that kind of ATP and NADPH. Okay? So during the Calvin cycle, CO2 is incorporated into organic compounds through what we call carbon fixation. Basically, after all that happens, we make some stuff happen and we produce a sugar. Okay? The Calvin cycle is often called the dark reactions or the light-independent reactions because none of the steps require light directly. So you do hear Calvin cycle, dark reactions, and light-independent, and all of those are correct. All right? So quick thing here, I love this diagram, and this would probably be the best diagram to go with. And then I promise we'll take a break here, but this is the best diagram for this. And we'll review it in a different format in the table. But what happens in our thylakoid of our chloroplast, notice we have a chloroplast. So we have H2O coming into the light reactions, okay, into the thylakoids through the light reactions. And we have O2 as a product. Okay. What also came in was this thing called an NAD+, which we'll talk about later, an ADP, and we ended up forming an ATP and an NADPH with some little electrons attached. Okay. Those little electrons that are attached in the ATP go into the Calvin cycle along with some CO2, and it ends up producing a sugar. At the end of it, it forms an NAD+ and an ADP, which go back into the light reactions. You can see that the Calvin cycle occurs in the stroma, or the juicy stuff that's in the chloroplast, and that's kind of what happens. All right. So again, we'll take this one step by step. This is going to be the best diagram and probably the most detail that I will ask you in regards to photosynthesis, because it is the best kind of representation and the most essential details, if you will. Okay. All right, so really quickly, I don't think we did a great job at that last time, but we're going to go into, so what is this stupid thing? Okay, actually, let me drop back real quick. I do want to make sure that you have the actual reaction for photosynthesis, and I'm just going to end up writing it here, but our chemical reaction for it, okay, for photosynthesis, and you should be able to see it here, but just in case you didn't quite get it, it's going to be, I'll give you the balanced equation. 6 CO2 plus 6, oh my goodness, H2O yields C6H12O6, okay, plus 6 O2s. And so if you see this, here's the chemistry part of this stuff. You might want to write it out in a way that you can see it, but you can see our two products down here at the bottom of the arrows, our oxygen and our sugar, and our two reactants are water and carbon dioxide. Think about it. It should make sense for photosynthesis. It's taking in CO2 from the atmosphere. We know that, and you must water your plants. Okay? There are other places where I usually put that in, but I'm trying very hard to kind of condense your stuff down. That being said, I know we're past the 10-minute mark. We're at about the 15-minute mark, and we're going to move on to the next section. So I'm encouraging you guys to pause the video, stretch, get a snack. Snack will be really good for this one because we're going to talk about making ATP. So get a snack, and then you can demonstrate what's going on in cellular respiration. It'll be perfect. All right. So break also in there. chunk your notes, write some questions out to the side, write yourself some summaries, make sure you sort of see what's going on in photosynthesis, breathe, relax, and then come back. All right, so chapter 6 is really what covers cellular respiration, and it's super, super important to know. Actually, let's give you an essential question. What's the process of cellular respiration? I hope you can read this. Woo! I'm going to write CR. Cellular respiration. Here's your question. Okay. There you go. All right. So it is super important to know when we start with photosynthesis. So we started kind of there. We're taking sunlight energy in. It's taking in that CO2 and the water as those plants are being watered. And it's able to give us some sugars and some oxygen. Okay, so the other thing is that a mitochondria has to use this. So a mitochondria is where cellular respiration is occurring. It's taking in organic molecules in O2 and producing ATP, which is sort of like a little AA battery that's producing work. At the end of cellular respiration, you end up with CO2 and water. Okay. The big thing about this, though, is that I don't have the best graphic here, is that plants still have mitochondria. So it's kind of like the whole chloroplast thing. Chloroplast, it's like the whole idea of it is doing the photosynthesis is to sort of like make food. It's almost like its own little mini chef. It makes food and it's delicious, but there is no point in making food if the plant can also then process and sort of eat the food. And that's kind of the whole idea of the mitochondria is to process and eat the food so we can get energy from it in a useful way. Okay, so both plants and animals have mitochondria. All right, to step back just a little bit, and I'm not going to ask you too much on this one, but just so you know and you can sort of see it, is that respiration as it relates to breathing and cellular respiration are not the same. Respiration in the breathing sense refers to an exchange of gases. Usually an organisms bring in oxygen from the environment and releases CO2 as a waste. But cellular respiration is aerobic, or oxygen requiring, and the harvesting of energy from food molecules by cells. So cellular respiration is just not a gas exchange, it's an energy kind of harvesting situation. Okay, so sort of you could see gas exchange is occurring in the lungs, but cellular respiration is actually being carried out in each individual cell. And if you notice, here's our kind of the terms. It is the chemical equation for this one. And I hope you see some familiarity with it and photosynthesis. Okay, because we're starting with glucose and oxygen, and we're going to end up with CO2 and H2O. So notice some things about them. Okay, so cellular respiration is what we call exergonic. We're not going too far into this, but the whole idea is that it releases energy. And a process that transfers energy from the bonds of glucose, so the sugar, to our little ATP, which is kind of like a AA battery that can do work within the cells. Cellular respiration in general can produce up to 32 molecules of ATP for each glucose molecule. It uses about 34% of the original energy stored in the glucose molecule, and the other 66% is released as heat. When you get into physics stuff, and that whole idea of thermodynamics is that you really can't get things back once they're heat. So when 66 or kind of 2/3 of a particular molecule is lost as heat, it increases entropy or disorder in the universe, and you don't get that back. You just don't. So really, every time that we're eating something, we're only using about 1/3 of the energy that's stored within the food that we're eating. So that's pretty crazy. So this energy conversion efficiency is better than most energy conversion systems. Only about 25% of the energy in gasoline produces the kinetic energy of movement of a car. So we're sort of more efficient than a car, sort of. All right. Good thing to remember here is the chemical equation. We'll review both of them, even though maybe I didn't quite give you the first one for photosynthesis, but this is the chemical equation for cellular respiration, and it's handy to know. Okay, respiration. Made it up quickly. But it's sort of, don't overthink these things because it's easy to confuse them, but cellular respiration is the only one of the two that you can do. You can't photosynthesize. You're not that magical. Neither am I. All right? It's just not happening. But cellular respiration can happen for everything, and it's what you do. So on a daily basis, you're going to eat stuff, and then you're going to inhale and breathe in, right? You're breathing in oxygen. So because you're eating and because you're breathing, you can actually convert some of that stuff when we get carbon dioxide as we exhale. You produce a little water in there. So handy thing is because you're eating, sometimes you're thirsty and your body will say, let's eat something so we can get water. A lot of confusing systems in the body. But in doing so, in eating and breathing, you can create energy. That's the whole reason. That's why you're supposed to be eating breakfast and stuff. Get something in your body in the morning anyway, because if you do that and then you breathe some, you will create ATP, which will help you get through the brain power of your morning. I promise. Okay. Here's a little connection. Your body actually requires a continuous supply of energy just to stay alive, to keep your heart pumping and beating. You have no control over that, but you need energy to do so. So an average adult needs about 2,200 what are called kilocalories a day. About 75% of these calories are used to maintain your healthy body, and the other 25 to power physical activities like writing notes or walking around or whatever it is that you do. Okay? I just like to use writing notes because I feel like that's relevant, and I hope that's what you're doing right now. Okay? A balance of energy intake and expenditure is required to maintain a healthy weight. All right, so a kilocalorie is actually, and we won't ask you a whole lot about this one. Actually, I will ask you to define this one because it is relevant to human being. But a kilocalorie is kind of the quantity of heat required to raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree Celsius. It's the same as what's a food calorie. So if you look on the back of like foods and stuff like that, and it says, oh, well, this is 60 calories. That means it's 60 kilocalories. You take 60 as a quantity of heat, so 60 heat, whatever, to raise, whatever. My brain is, I've got to think through that one before we discuss it, but write it down. I'll have you know I'm making this lecture at like 11 p.m. It's not my finest hour, so it we'll just come back to it, but at least define it for me. All right. You know that feeling. Some of you guys have been awake entirely too long at some points in time, and then it hasn't gone over very well. We both know this. Same for me. All right, so it's used to measure nutritional values indicated on food labels. Yeah. Here's some activities just about kilocalories consumed per hour. So if it's about a 150-pound person, if you ran 8 or 9 miles per hour, if you did that for an entire hour, you'd burn about 1,000 calories. Even just sitting and writing can burn about 28 calories an hour. I mean, really, I think you have to be like not moving very far. I think if you're writing pretty intensely, you probably burn more calories. All right. So anyways, that's just some basic activities. So encourage your family to do some walk and talk activities or something, because burning calories is good for us. All right, back onto the actual cellular respiration part, which I got us at 25 minutes almost. So it's another good time to take a break, get a snack, whatever it is, walk around a little bit, shake a little bit, whatever you got to do, and then get your mind back in the game. All right, so how do your cells extract energy from glucose? The answer involves a transfer of electrons during chemical equations, which we'll talk about. Energy can be released from glucose by simply burning it. So we could just take glucose and we could burn it. But the electrons fall very rapidly and the energy is dissipated as heat and light, and we actually can't use that. Like, it sounds like fun, but you can't actually use that as a living system. There's no point to it. So cellular respiration is actually a much more controlled descent of electrons, and it's sort of like rolling things down an energy hill so we can extract that energy from them. Energy released in small amounts and can be stored in the chemical bonds of ATP. That's our ultimate goal, is to get kind of the energy, potential energy that's stored in chemicals, or the chemical of glucose, to ATP. All right, so we're going to talk quickly. Again, these are good reference ones that are nice to have because these are the depth that we'll discuss at in class, so you want to make sure that you have it with you. All right, cellular respiration consists of a sequence of steps that can be divided into 3 stages. So stage 1 is glycolysis. Stage 2 is what we call pyruvate oxidation, though that's part of it. The biggest one is the citric acid cycle. And then the third one is called oxidative phosphorylation. So we'll go through these things in class and make sure that we have them, but this is the reference point. So glycolysis, the first thing is that it happens in the cytosol or the cytoplasm. It's the start of cellular respiration, and really its whole thing is it breaks glucose down into pyruvate. So our first kind of reactant there is glucose, and it makes a thing called pyruvate. All right, that's step 1. Again, probably not going to get all that right now, but we're going to discuss it much more in class and go through pictures. Stage 2, pyruvate oxidation is in there. For me, I usually consider it kind of like a 1.5 step. Like, I don't kind of give it its own thing. But the citric acid cycle, for sure we do. That's definitely stage 2. This one takes place in the mitochondria. And it takes our pyruvate that we made in the last step, and it actually kind of we'll make it into kind of this other kind of 2-carbon compound, which will move into the citric acid cycle, and it actually supplies a whole bunch of electrons to stage 3. That's about it. So the cell makes a small amount of ATP during this time, along with glycolysis, and it just doesn't make a whole lot. Again, probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We take a few notes here and there on that one, and then we will go through it and probably more detail than you want in class. But trust me, we could go in a lot more detail if we had time. No, I'm just saying, like, if we hadn't lost some time, we would have spent some time on this. Believe you me. All right, stage 3 is what we call oxidative phosphorylation. And so we take NADH, this is going to be like a little electron carrier, along with FADH2, and they actually shuttle electrons to something called an electron transport chain. Okay. Most of our ATP by cellular respiration is generated in this stage, which is a key point to note, is that's where it happens. And it uses energies released from the downfall of electrons, or downhill fall of electrons from NADH and FADH2, along with oxygen, to phosphorylate ADP. So basically just to make ATP. That's the whole thing with step 3. We're using the NADH and FADH2 that are made in the other 2 steps, along with oxygen, to produce a crap ton of ATP. Yay! Again, probably still a little fuzzy, but we will take it step by step and do lots of discussions and look at tons of pictures. But if we did all that now, we would have a very long lecture. Okay? As the electron transport chain passes electrons down this energy hill, still in stage 3, it also pumps hydrogen ions across the inner mitochondrial membrane. But the big thing is that it's going up the concentration gradient. Up the concentration gradient for these hydrogen or protons. If we have this kind of potential energy thing going on, we'll have what's called chemiosmosis. But again, we're going to avoid that one for right this second. So here's the basic thing, which this is, again, one of my favorite little diagrams because it shows you where everything's happening and gives you the real big summary on this one. So again, we'll go through all the details next time, but this is a great picture and diagram to go from. So glycolysis, we had glucose where we start with, our major kind of reactant there. In glycolysis, it produces a tiny bit of ATP and pyruvate. Okay, the pyruvate does some things before it can go into the citric acid cycle. Citric acid cycle basically produces ATP. And both of these first two stages have produced what's called NADH and FADH2. And they have these little electrons attached to them. That's what those little blue dots with the negative signs are. These guys actually move all the way over to this third stage called oxidative phosphorylation. They dump their little electrons off over here, and just kind of dropping those electrons off is enough work that when we add in some oxygen to this stage, oh boy, we get a whole bunch of ATP. All right. So it's crazy, and I understand that. But keep all these things as a reference. I really don't have in the next class period. I don't have anything else planned for you guys. We're not going to do labs. We're not going to mess around with it. We are just going to work together to try to understand the graphics and the materials so that way you can see it. Because I don't want to do you guys a disservice and not show you the material. Like, you got to see it. But it is worthwhile. It's worthwhile for us to discuss it. So we want to make sure that we get the basics and the highlights as you move forward. Side note, we're at the end here. Easter egg. It's a good Easter egg time. Easter egg. So there's a diagram that had a nice little, it had a chloroplast, and then it had the mitochondria, and then it had the reactants and products between the two of them, something like that. How about you take a look at that one and draw that for me on a piece of paper and bring it to me, and we'll make sure that gets added to the test. Not the quiz, but to the test. Okay, so look for this graphic. If you have questions on that one, shoot me an email. All right? And if you have questions about anything else, you should shoot me an email. All right?